reading. Like I said, most of this stuff is also AP stuff. Star just asked for some little picky names here and there and some picky events, but definitely you'll want to watch the 1960s. I did 3 parts yesterday. One part was JFK domestic, where I talked about his election. I talked about what he tried to do in his new frontier, and the fact that Kennedy, I keep saying that, but Kennedy did not get a lot accomplished. It was more about what he might have been, maybe if he'd had a second term or lived longer than basically 2 years and a half or so of his presidency, or a little bit more than 2.5 years, almost 3, of his time. No, it was just a little over 2 years, I guess, if that. Oh, I can't do the math. I was told there'd be no math. Anyway, all right. So, been a long day. All right. So yesterday I talked about JFK. I did 3 videos, y'all. Those of you watching this at home, I talked about Kennedy's domestic policy, the new frontier, some of his achievements like the Peace Corps. So I did one PowerPoint basically on that. I put that video up last night. It took forever for it to process. Then I did one on and also the space race, by the way, I included in that. Very, very important. Even though, I mean, we did accomplish some things in space while Kennedy was in there for sure. But really, of course, the landing of the man on the moon happens after his successor, Richard Nixon, in 1969. But I talked about some of the positive things that came out of it. We talked about foreign affairs, which Kennedy was, of course, very, very much involved in, with the Berlin crisis, where once again the Soviets threatened to cut off Berlin, but fortunately did not do so. But ultimately, they built a Berlin Wall that split East and West Berlin. JFK went there, did his famous Ich bin ein Berliner, I'm a Berliner speech. We also talked about his terrible mistake early on in his presidency, the Bay of Pigs, where Cuban exiles were trained by the United States, invaded Cuba, but it went really, really badly. They did not get the support they thought they would from the air and even from American ships nearby, and they ended up being captured. This is going to lead to the crisis the following year and a half later, called the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Khrushchev, the leader of Russia, stationed intermediate and medium nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is only 90 miles from the very tip of the Florida Keys. Kennedy resolved this in an intelligent way through a quarantine. A lot of people were pressing for him to invade, to attack Cuba, but he knew that would kill probably a lot of Soviets or Russians and lead us into a war. Most historians credit him with some really sanity and handling the Cuban Missile Crisis well. And then another accomplishment of his was getting a nuclear test ban treaty passed, or at least through. The test ban treaty stopped testing in the atmosphere and testing in the water of nuclear weapons. You could still test underground. That was seen not to have the kind of dangers. And we ended with the speech that he did that was beautiful in there, and you can watch that video. The last PowerPoint, the last little video, was quite short, and it dealt with JFK's assassination. And I didn't really say this in the lecture yesterday. I mentioned it maybe at the beginning. But as I said, Kennedy's really much more about a president and the hopes he engendered, the hopes he inspired. You know, he was young. He had an attractive wife. He had little kids. He really encouraged Americans to go out and try things. And a lot of young people especially were excited having somebody like him as president. So when he's suddenly assassinated, it really breaks the hearts of a lot of people. And a lot of people feel that that's when the 60s went from being kind of just a continuation of the 50s to this kind of crazy, very turbulent kind of era. Now, I ended yesterday by talking about the Warren Commission. There were all kinds of suspicions about who killed Kennedy, suspicions that continue to this day. I've read 100 or more books on this, y'all, literally. I'm not sure still sometimes what to believe. In my heart of hearts, I do believe that it was probably Lee Harvey Oswald, the suspected assassin, up there shooting. But who he had connections with. Was there somebody else across the way, in the behind the fence on top of the grassy knoll who maybe took a shot? Possibly too, and that would probably suggest that a conspiracy. Oswald, the scary thing is, had lived in the Soviet Union. He defected there. He had tried to go to Cuba. And so there were all these possibilities. What if Castro put him up to it? What if the Soviets put him up to it? What if the anti-Castro people put him up to it? Because he had some connections to the anti-Castro people. And so it still is a problem today. And the reason it's a problem is we never got to have a trial for him. He was murdered as he was being transferred. Now, the thing about the Warren Commission, it seemed to be a pretty airtight case. They concluded that he was a lone nut, Oswald, and that the man who shot Oswald, Jack Ruby, was also a lone nut. So the lone nut shot a lone nut. Everybody can rest assured. But they eventually released the 26 volumes of evidence. You could buy it. And people started going through this and the volumes of evidence, and they started finding some real problems. And this is what bothers people today is we know there was a lot of things that wasn't shared with the commission. The commission, for example, was not told about the attempts to kill Fidel Castro. They weren't told about a lot of interesting other connections out there. And so in the 1970s, we had a second commission that actually did conclude that a shot was fired from the grassy knoll, but that it missed. And that hasn't satisfied a lot of people. So my point here is, as the 60s roll on, you start getting a lot of Americans, especially young Americans, feeling like we were lied to, that the government didn't do its part. And a lot of people point to that kind of distrust that you and I, a lot of us have in government today. Like, what's the old joke? How can I tell a politician is lying? Because their lips are moving, right? You know, every time. And you didn't used to have that, y'all. But a lot of people kind of felt first with the Warren Commission's omissions, with the Watergate scandal, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and other problems, Iran-Contra, and things like that, that faith in government has really, really eroded in the last 50 years or so. All right? So let's go to President Johnson here. And that's the subject of what we're going to talk about today mainly. If you go, let's see, 2 sheets of paper. On the back of the second sheet here, you will see where it says the Johnson presidency, 1963 to 1968. It actually should read till 1969 because he was president until January of 1969. January 20th is when he left office. So go to the Johnson presidency. Just some background here. He is a Texan. He was a teacher. He was a speech coach right here in H-Town at Sam Houston High School. He was, of course, in the House of Representatives. He was in the Senate, and was the youngest majority leader in the U.S. history. Now, that's not all in there, but the thing is, he had incredible amounts of power, and I mentioned this yesterday. As a Senate Majority Leader, he was really, except for the president, probably the most powerful man in our government. And a lot of people wondered, why would this guy give that up to become vice president? Because as you guys have seen in y'all's lifetime, vice presidents don't have a lot of power. So why would he give it up? But allegedly, and Kennedy, by the way, Kennedy and his brother Bobby, who hated him, hated LBJ, as he was known by, they really thought he would turn it down. It's sort of like when you invite somebody to a party because you got to, but you really expect they'll say no. And then suddenly they're like, oh, yeah, I'll be there. And you're like, really? It's going to be boring. Why would you want to go? And you're finding yourself trying to talk them out of it. But Johnson, this is awful, y'all. His advisor, John Connally, who is the man sitting in front of President Kennedy later when Kennedy is shot, his advisor, John Connally, said, you know, about 1 out of 3 vice presidents somehow become president. And Johnson's like, I like those odds. And in fact, it probably would have been very hard for a Democrat from the South to get elected, y'all. There were still a lot of bad feelings about Southerners from the Civil War and Southern Democrats and that kind of thing. So Johnson perhaps could become vice president, but it's unlikely he would have become president had he not piggybacked on with JFK. The big thing that's going to be he's famous for is his effort on behalf of African Americans for civil rights. And the second, of course, was his efforts to try to end poverty. But the sad thing for him is a lot of this is going to be scuttled due to the Vietnam War. His wife, Lady Bird, who, believe it or not, just recently died just a few years ago, y'all. She lived to be over 100. Now, I don't know why this is showing now. It shouldn't be in there. But ultimately, we're going to come up with, hey, Talia, I didn't see you come in, man. Awesome. How was your test today? Awesome. Okay. So anyway, we're going to talk about the election of 64. It's an important one later on. But Johnson, remember, y'all, gets basically a year of one of Kennedy's term, right, of Kennedy's first term. He's president from November to January, November of 63 to January of 65. And so on his own, I mean, excuse me, for there. Okay, hey, how y'all doing? All right, now one of the other things too, we're going over the 60s here, Dave and Johnson. So one of the things you guys might want to write down is the 24th Amendment. Now, African Americans technically could vote in the American South because of the 14th and the 15th Amendment, which made them into citizens and then gave them the right to vote. But in many cases, there were other things that had limited them from voting. Poll taxes, white-only primaries, inability to join political parties. But one of the things, y'all, was a poll tax. This was a tax that was required that you pay before you could vote. Now, it wasn't super expensive, but if you're poor, that could be bad. So the 24th Amendment was one of these things that was pushed out of the way that made it easier for African Americans to be able to vote. All right, Great Society. You need to associate this with President Johnson. Now, Johnson, y'all, this is by far the most far-reaching, as it says in your handout here from the 60s, the most far-reaching program of social legislation since the New Deal. He had worked for President Roosevelt here in Texas. And in a lot of ways, y'all, LBJ said he wanted to out FDR. In other words, he wanted to get even more legislation done. He wanted to take it to the next level. Okay, and so he outlined it at a speech at the University of Michigan in May of 64. So this is just, 6 months after JFK's assassination? A lot of these ideas, remember, are those that JFK had made. But remember, as I said yesterday, Kennedy was not very good at getting his legislation through. Johnson had a lot more experience. He knew what buttons to push, when to use the carrot and reward people, when to use the stick and punish people. There was something called the Johnson treatment, where he would get in your face. And he was a big, tall guy, y'all. He was as tall as Lincoln. He was like 6'4". And he could get in your face and just absolutely make you break down. And he would do that. So here, let's just kind of see if this plays. All right, let me turn this on. All righty. Take just a sec. I had this turned off.
And think of what America was like before these programs were adopted. Life was very different.
There was an outbreak of hope across this country. It was quixotic, it was kind of Arthurian, this idea of might for right.
These things were all resonating to this day.
I really don't know where I'd be without Job Corps.
Thank God for Medicare.
I can feel worthy. I can be great.
I think many of the Great Society programs were so successful, they had an impact on so many of our lives in an overwhelmingly positive way. We have to question, why did we move away from that?
You just see some of them like PBS. If any of you guys watch PBS, that came from it. There's Johnson signing
Great
it.
Society was a cluster of projects undertaken by the president.
He saw racial discrimination and he saw poverty as moral issues, not just as political issues.
In 1964, Johnson and the civil rights groups managed to pass the first major civil rights legislation.
Okay, 64,
It was
right?
the first comprehensive civil rights legislation in the United States since 1875.
The Civil Rights Act said public accommodations have to be available to everybody. No
So you can't
discrimination
discriminate
on the basis of
publicly
race. So with one fell swoop,
based on race.
the Great Society wiped out all the whites-only signs.
This administration today declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
The war on poverty was part of this idea that you have not a handout, but a hand up.
In the 60s, it was hard scrabble for a lot of folks. And what we saw with the war on poverty was, for a lot of people, it just meant jobs.
What it's saying is we're going to bring the less affluent into the mainstream of the society.
When Lyndon Johnson became president, the poverty rate was about 22%. When he left office 5 years later, the poverty rate was 13%.
So cut it in half,
The
basically.
greatest one-time reduction in poverty in the history of this country.
Maybe the greatest impact that
Hey,
the
Medicare.
society had has been the Medicare program. Up until Medicare was passed, people who reached the age of 65 did not have guaranteed health insurance of any kind. And of course, Medicare now has tens of millions of people in it, and it seems like a humane and generous act of the society.
He called in his old
Most
teacher, and
presidents are just
she was
happy to
there
have
for the
one or
state
two
signing of it.
pieces of legislation that endured, that had a historical resonance to it. Johnson slammed out bill after bill, act after act.
In education alone, he proposed legislation to provide scholarships, grants, and work-study programs for college students. Today, that legislation provides the resources for 60% of the people that are in college in the United States of America.
I got the maximum amount any person could get to go to college. I certainly would not have been able to attend school without this type of help.
America is always best when it is operating close to its founding ideas. Among those founding ideas is that it's our country. and
Okay, so that was a good overview. Of course, a very positive spin on it. A lot of critics have attacked it as wasteful, as spending a lot of money. And the thing is, in a lot of ways, we'll never really know. Could it have worked? Because instead of just a war on poverty, President Johnson's also going to have to fight a war against North Vietnam. And it's kind of hard to fight two different wars. And he ended up giving up on both of them, or we did, in a lot of ways. So remember, it was all about the Great Society, y'all. Was all about making more opportunity for people. I'm going to go through some of the organizations just so you guys have a list of them. The War on Poverty, you heard him declare that. The technical name for it was the Economic Opportunity Act. As you'll see, he got JFK's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, who had headed the Peace Corps, to run this. Job Corps to get people experience, and in a way, kind of like a Peace Corps, but for the United States. Medicare. This had been something that President Truman had tried to get done, and Kennedy had tried to get done, but couldn't get passed. Johnson, like him, hate him, whatever, he was great at getting legislation passed, and we still have that today. Also, you might want to note Medicaid. It looks like Medicare, but it's spelled Medicaid with an AID. This was medical assistance for poor people, right? So Medicare was for old people, think care, they need extra care. Aid, Medicaid was for your younger people. Also, a lot of money went to the cities. Remember how we talked about how a lot of whites had left the cities? The cities had really deteriorated as far as the tax bases go. And the cities had had some real problems and violence. And he got a lot of money. Rental assistance for the poor, helped rebuild things. urban planning, some things like that. All right, so the Great Society, like we said, he got many of the things that JFK wanted. He wanted this war on poverty. His idol had been Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And as I said, his goal was to get even more legislation through in 100 days than FDR had. He said it frequently. He wanted to out FDR as far as getting policies passed for people. Here you just see some of those. You don't have to know all of these, but you see things like, he created the Department of Transportation we have today. Also, a lot of positive environmental things that you and I take for granted today. The Clean Air Act, okay, for example, and that basically helped get a lot of lead and stuff out of the gasoline. Public broadcasting, Channel 8 here in town. That was one of the things. So we've mentioned Medicare already. Okay, and then just a listing of some of these things, more than you guys need to know. Food stamps, for example, work study programs, Head Start, right? The idea of Head Start was to help these kids that maybe were born poor and didn't have, parents pushing reading or parents who could work with them. And in fact, when I was visiting Johnson's home a few weeks ago, because you can tour it now, there's a Head Start building right across the street from it. And a lot of this, y'all, I mean, I'm not so, such a crazy optimist that I believe Johnson did all this just because he was a good person. I do believe he had some political, goals and stuff and that kind of thing in there. But also, y'all, he'd been a teacher and he had taught a bunch of poor Mexican immigrant kids. And he saw them come in hungry. He saw them come in without things. And he said that idea or that image never, ever left him. The Job Corps, like we said, this was kind of like the New Deal CCC. This would be young people could go and get vocational training. They could learn a trade. They could, get help finding a job. There's more pictures of Job Corps. Vista, still around to this day, although it's more like AmeriCorps today. Vocational training, help people that were maybe disadvantaged get more training. Food stamps, which, today we have, like in Texas, the Lone Star card. In Louisiana, they have the Louisiana Purchase. This was a way to help fight poverty by making sure families had enough money to get by, right? Individual states administered then as they do to this day. And we do see more and more money, of course, going to families with dependent children. And that's been one criticism. Some people believe that if you start giving people money like this, then they're going to expect it. It's going to be hard to get them off of it. And that's a big criticism. They're, like I said, doing a lot to try to get money to education. Okay, Medicare, we already talked about that. He got Truman out and they dusted him off and let Truman be there, and he became one of the first people to get Medicare, something he had tried to do but not been able to do. There you see just a thing about Medicare. You do have to pay part of it, and it's somewhat complicated. Okay, Kennedy had tried to do that. Okay, now, so we go to where it says, okay, let's look at the top of the next page. It says changes in immigration policy. I don't have a slide on this. I should, and I do on my immigration PowerPoint. But immigration, y'all, we had in the 1920s limited it severely, right? We were trying to keep a lot of the people out, the Italians, the people from Eastern Europe, but we had not done a lot since then as far as immigration. Well, the McCarran-Walter Act in the 50s had kept the immigration at those 20s levels. But then in 1965, largely the work of President Kennedy's other brother, Ted or Edward Kennedy, we passed a very, very big immigration act. And basically, every country had the same quota for its legal immigrants coming here. Also, and this has been one criticism of it, if you had relatives here already, you got preference over other people. If you had certain skills that we needed, you got preference. And why some people criticize the first part is what some people, critics, call chain migration. somebody comes here, then they bring their brother and sister-in-law. Then the sister-in-law brings her brother and his family, and so forth and so on, and you get this giant, giant group. But also, it did limit, for the first time, Latin America immigration. All right, now you saw the picture earlier about Goldwater. Now, Goldwater, y'all, it's still one of my favorite campaign pictures of all time. I don't have it on this PowerPoint, but some people had a bumper sticker that said AUH2O. Now, what is AUH2O? Goldwater in chemistry. And then one of my favorites, I've got a button with this, it has a glass of water, and the water is gold. Goldwater. Now, Goldwater was very, very conservative. Now, today, you guys usually think of Republicans as super conservatives. That wasn't the case. There were a lot of pretty moderate Republicans back in the day, but Goldwater was more like the Republicans people have today. He saw everything very different from Lyndon Johnson. He believed, of course, that it was not the job of the federal government to do this. This was a states thing. He didn't like Johnson getting involved with enforcing putting some of the stuff down people's throat. He was worried about creeping socialism. He also believed that Social Security should be made into a private thing, not run by the government. And also, he was very critical of what was happening in Vietnam. Now, the war, at least the United States, we had only been sending advisors, y'all, to train the South Vietnamese forces to fight against some of the North Vietnamese who were coming down and invading South Vietnam. But we weren't fighting yet. He wanted to get tough with Cuba. He wanted to get tough with North Vietnam. And some people said, because he mentioned it, that it might be necessary to use a small yield nuclear weapon. This scared a lot of people, okay? Now, Johnson, of course, had a long ways to go, and we'll talk about this when we talk about Vietnam coming up here. But in August 1964, this is what, 2 or 3 months before the election, a couple of American destroyers, those are small ships, are in the Gulf of Tonkin off of North Vietnam. On one of the dates, they were fired upon, or at least one was fired upon. The later incident in the Tonkin Gulf, we're not so sure if it really happened or not. Some people think since it happened at night, it might have been something else. But he used that to get Congress to give him the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which basically said, Mr. President, you have all the power you need to make sure American forces are protected in Vietnam. And it really marks the beginning of America seriously in the Vietnam War in August of 1964. Now, that made him look tough, right? And it probably helped him quite a bit. But also, y'all, and this was somewhat unfair, and I saw Goldwater talk, he said, he didn't like the way that he was painted. This is today when you guys see negative ads where they do nothing about what they're going to do as president. All they say is what the other guy is going to do wrong. That was one of the first cases of super, super negative advertisement. And so Goldwater was painted as an absolute crazy person. And it didn't help. He said some crazy things sometimes, like there can be no, what was it? Let's see. He said extremism in the name of, or moderation in the, I can't even remember it, y'all. I feel so bad. But basically, he said you cannot be too extreme if you're defending liberty, but you can be too moderate, basically. So he said extremism in the name of liberty is no vice. That was the quote. Extremism in the name of liberty is no vice. In other words, if you care about liberty, there is no limit to what you should do. Now, what you're going to see here is probably the most famous political ad in history. It was shown only one time because it was so powerful. Basically, it's called the Daisy Girl commercial. I think it should advertise how we need to improve our educational system, because listen to this girl count.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6,
Little girl just blew up.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So it's like if you vote for the other guy, they're going to blow up little girls who can't count with nuclear weapons, right? I mean, it was pretty bad. They even had one where like a little girl was licking some ice cream, and they're like, ice cream's like so good, unless it's got like cesium-65 and uranium and all this and stuff like that in it. I mean, and they even said that Goldwater, because some Klan members had liked him, that Goldwater was basically part of the Klan. Now, they didn't run that one. So they painted him incredibly negatively. Now, did they mention Goldwater in that ad at all? Did they use his name? No. But they basically said, unless you vote for Johnson and not the other guy, bad stuff's going to happen. So the Daisy Girl or the Daisy ad, y'all should remember. And so when the election was done, y'all, Johnson won in a true landslide. You can see that right there. Now remember, the colors are reversed. Today, red is Republican. And I keep saying I'm going to fix this, and I do for some slides and I don't the others. Johnson won basically the entire country. Goldwater was from Arizona. That's why he won that. Now remember, he's a Republican. Today this would be red. But this was scary, right? Remember, Democrats had always, since the Civil War, y'all, won the solid South. They had always gone that way. But look at all these states. And as it says here, y'all, Goldwater really helped revive conservatism. He even wrote a book, I think, The Culture of or The Conscience of a Conservative or something. Like I said, he was pretty tough. And there's that quote: extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And so they did paint him as there it is, the conscience of a conservative. They give you an outline of it. And so Johnson wins the biggest landslide since FDR had won big time in 36. To many people, this seemed to be a mandate for Johnson to keep doing what he had been doing. Now, was it that people really liked Johnson and what he was doing, or was it because they were so, scared of Goldwater, right? But as you can see here, some of those southern states began to defect from the Democratic Party and start to vote Republican. And this will continue, especially when Ronald Reagan runs. Okay, at the